Hello, welcome to the Augmented Mind podcast. I'm your host, Yijia. In today's episode, we welcome Zora Wang to join us.
After incorporating the human side into my research, I actually feel more empowered. We're building agents for humans to use. If you look at the human employment or where the economic value concentrates, the software engineer only captures around less than 5% of human employment.
We really know what this AI can do, but we also don't really know what other people want this AI to do.
For example, if we have a perfect depiction of the human agent profile and then aggregating both together, maybe we can achieve bigger things.
Hello, welcome to the Augmented Mind podcast. I'm your host, Yijia. In today's episode, we welcome Zora Wang to join us. Zora is a PhD candidate at Carnegie Mellon University. Her research focuses on the progressive adaptation of AI agents, where she builds methods such as agent workflow memory and agent skill induction to continually improve these AI agents on the job. More recently, she focused on comparing human and agent workflow to better team them up on a broad range of human work. I actually knew Zora at the very beginning of my research journey because we almost crossed paths during my time at Microsoft Research. I still remember seeing an article about her on the company's website around her work on building models for code and tabular data. It's really motivating to see female researchers doing a great job in the field. Right now, Zora is one of my collaborators, but I'm still curious to know, given her background is more around coding models and autonomous agents, why she starts to focus more on the human side, how she thinks about the relationship between human-agent collaboration and building solo agents. Finally, I also believe there are a lot of interesting stories behind her research trajectory, from building models for code to building agents that use code to help humans achieve more. The 6th episode of the AM podcast starts right now. Hi, Zora. Thank you so much for taking the trip to join us in person today at the Augmented Mind podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm super excited about today's conversation because, to be very honest, you're actually one of my research idols since I just started my start my research journey.
Nice.
Yeah, basically we actually I can't say cross paths, but when I just started doing research, I spent some time at Microsoft Research Asia, and I was actually working at the same group where you've actually spent some time there.
Yeah. I only noticed this later when I was in CMU, but it's so fun to know that we're actually working in the same group, and now we're collaborating again.
Yeah. That's how things happen. Yeah, also, I know you just fly back from the University of Washington, right, where you are actually giving a talk there.
Yeah.
What is the talk about?
So it's generally about my PhD work. I'm working on progressive adaptation of AI agents. So there are different parts on, first, fundamentally, how do you build agents to be adaptive from where they were previously static? And then second is there are more real-world tasks where how do you build agents to be adaptive to individuals and for longer horizons. So generally along that line.
So basically, I would say the keyword is more around adaptive agent kind of development.
Yeah.
So by adaptive, are you focused more on trying to make sure the agent can work for out-of-distribution environment, or is trying to do self-improvement?
Yeah, I think both. I think for different stages of agent development, they kind of mean different things. So in the beginning, I think 2 or 3 years ago, agents are barely working on even the simplest tasks. So at that time, adaptive can be learning from previous experiences, and when you see similar tasks later, you can reuse what you learned previously and adapt over experiences. But now they have pretty good basic abilities in solving tasks, and then we can tackle on more advanced stuff of, everyone have different preferences in solving tasks, where there are different workflows even for doing the same high-level goals. So how do you make agents to adapt to different scenarios? And also, as you said, there are different environments websites or software. So how to make agents adapt to individual environments too.
I'm trying to understand the concept here. So suppose I'm actually having a web browsing agent, right? Something like OpenAI's operator. Then suppose I give it task saying, oh, right now, helping me check the weather in Palo Alto. Then I would expect the agent will just do a sequence of actions, as you say here.
Yeah.
Is this the workflow in your definition?
Yeah. So in our implementation, it could be just based on the action space of the agent. For like web browsing agents, it's just click, type, scrolling, like the common computer use actions that human can do. And then the workflow essentially like stating the goal of the workflow like in natural language. And then you have the sequence of low-level actions to complete that goal.
But then I would expect like even just running the agent for like an hour, it will accumulate a really, really large number of workflows, right? Even before you say like we go to millions of tasks, we already got a lot of data. Then how could we effectively incorporate them into maybe the context window the model has?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, but that's also what I was trying to do. But I feel like for now, maybe even, that the benchmarks where like the data sets of agents that we have doesn't support like that scale yet. Okay. So I think it would be interesting to actually like find other sources or like find more richer sources to collect a bunch of agent trajectories. I think there are works that try to let the agent explore the environment just by like synthesizing tasks themselves and to accumulate that. I think that's one way to do it. And for the second part, like if we have that huge repository of tasks or workflows, how do you like let agents to integrate those? I guess from our experiments, one is at least for a particular user on a particular website or environment, there are a number of tasks you do, and it's just being instantiated with different contexts. So actually the procedure are shared most of the time. And another dimension is like a lot of tasks, for example, very long horizon tasks, there are like a million ways of creating such tasks on a website. But actually, if you like segment them into different like atomic tasks, some of them, like some of the long horizon tasks are actually just compositions of like this different atomic tasks. So that's what we're also trying to leverage in our work, agent workflow memory, to identify this reusable atomic chunks so that like once agents learns all of the atomic tasks, they can just, when deploying them at test time, it's just like composition of this different atomics.
Got you. So to try to summarize a little bit, so at least the workflow memory can have two utilities. One is to more like provide a demonstration. So for similar procedures, the agent can check like how it succeeded in the past. And the second is like they provide atomic reusable parts. Then maybe next time the agent don't need to do it action by action, but can use some way to trigger it.
Yeah, I think it kind of depends on the representation of the workflow. So in our first work, like agent workflow memory, we're storing that as textual workflows. So it's more used as a reference, as additional
So it's like
context.
the first utility I try to summarize.
Yeah, but we also like try to like extract workflows as like reusable units. So it also has that feature. But to use them, agent still needs to like just copy the low-level action step by step. In our follow-up work on skill induction, we're wrapping that like each workflow into a programmatic skill. So basically, it's like a high-level function that wraps all of the low-level implementations inside. So now, like to reuse that workflow, you can just call that high-level actions. Essentially the same as like tools that.
Yeah, I was
like
about to
humans
ask, like I think thinking about the development for the agent, to be very honest, when I just start my PhD, my research direction is human-agent collaboration. However, at that time, even people are suggesting me not using the term agent in all the work I'm doing. So if you look at the papers I wrote at that time, almost all the paper I'm saying like language model empowered system instead of saying it as an agent, just because I don't think it's sort of everyone is buying the term at that time. So I'm curious, what leads you to doing this agent research from a very, very early time?
Yeah. So I started with like doing like back in like MSRA where we're kind of like structured table analysis, and I think a lot of them is just like generating programs to do like structured execution on the tabular environment. And I think that got me really interested in code generation in general. And I'm doing a lot of like code generation tasks at the start of my PhD, I think. And then I feel like beyond just like doing coding tasks, I really think code generation is a very general method to solve a lot of different real-world tasks. So that's why I like kind of expanded that. Where back to the agent topic is, I feel like agent is essentially just generating code or generating programs, because each action is just a tool, a function. So it's the output process is essentially just generating code. And I think the interesting part of it is it can be applied to a wide variety of tasks beyond just like generating, software programs. So I think that's what got me interested in agents in general.
Okay. You actually just mentioned 3 different terms, right? One is tool, another is action, and the third one is skill. And I also know, like in your own work, you use this skill induction to mention like the reusable part in the workflow. But it's kind of very interesting if you think about like even these terms towards the agent, they seem to be using it in an interchangeable way.
Yeah.
But for human, it seems like we pose very different impression on it. Even think about recently, I think after Anthropic released the skill feature last year, there's just like a movement. Everyone's starting to build skills for their own stuff, right? And if you look at the repository, every day there may be thousands of new skills invented, added to the repository. So it seems like people put a very, very different impression on these 3 type of things.
Well, I mean, yeah, I feel like for humans, skill does have another different interpretation. Like, for example, when I was looking at the ONET database that captures like different, or the US occupations, and they have this annotation of human skills, but it's more like conceptual or like cognitive skills, like reasoning, understanding, and it's like on a different, at least on a different abstraction level to like what we're like inducing from the agent trajectories. Yeah, I feel like there are different interpretations of words, but it's kind of confusing too, because like what Anthropic means skills is not like what we mean in skills. At least the representation is slightly different. But I guess it's in general all like kind of recipe of doing a particular task or to achieve a particular goal.
I see. So basically, if I understand in this way, is even though they represent the same kind of action for the agent, but basically it tries to summarize different level, right? Like for a lot of human skill people have in their mind, their skill is more in the abstract level, like, oh, maybe Yijia is a critical thinking person, right? This is some skill like people have in mind. But from the agent perspective, it's basically a part of the reusable workflow it can go to execute.
Well, I think there are kind of both human and agent can have, where you can discuss their skills from at different granularity levels. And I think the reason why maybe some of the early works on agent skills are like very low level is because agents don't have that like great capability or autonomy yet, so people are still working on the low level stuff. But I guess like for humans, you can also say, oh, this person's good at editing photos or like writing abstract or like writing titles, things like that. And that's very low level compared to a higher level is like speaking or writing skills.
Got you. Actually, to take a step back, when you start to look at agent workflow, are you mainly trying to improve the agent capability since they are not so good at that time, or is like there is a larger motivation behind?
Well, I guess there are 2 parts. One is like, first, definitely to improve the agent capabilities because they're not improving very well on very simple tasks. And I feel like there are a lot of similarity, like shared reusable units in different tasks, but like agents just keep making the same mistake on like different tasks, even though the agents have been like doing those tasks multiple times. So as long as like, I think one part of that is if the agent can reflect on it and like learn something from previous experiences and like carry that when solving later tasks, that'll be helpful. Another experiments we did is on like testing the agent generalization. So the benefit of this adaptive agent loop is like you don't need pre-annotated training examples. So you only need like test time queries, and that basically avoids issues when the training and task domain gaps are big. So hopefully the agent will be able to generalize new tasks or new domains much better.
How is the transferability test conducted? So it's like trying to give the agent a new environment to see what is successful, or like you guys set up some new methodology to study this? Because I feel this is super interesting, right? Like right now, definitely those companies are keep post-training the models, but since these agents are getting more and more powerful, people are trying to use them in their very specific environments.
Yeah. So at that time, there's a benchmark called Mind2Web. So they have different task splits compared to their training set. There's like cross-task, meaning that you have tasks on the same website, same domain, but just doing different stuff. And also like cross-website, which is like same domain but different websites. Like you have training examples on Amazon, but test examples on like Target. And they also have like the last one is cross-domain, so are totally different domains. So it just like compare our method to the baseline method on different task splits, and find that like as we move from cross-task to website to domain, our method performs increasingly better compared to the baseline, and it's like more robust to this like distributional gap.
Got you. Actually, I have a maybe spicy question. Like based on my understanding, right now to study this workflow, our major goal is to improve the agent capability, right? However, suppose those models, like those foundation models powering these agents, keep improving. Do you think we probably don't need this workflow memory anymore? Like basically, what you are doing, would it be washed away by next generation of language models?
Yeah, I think some of the early stuff, like the workflows that we induced in the paper like 3 years ago, are probably not useful for these models. Okay. But I feel like those tasks are very easy, or like relatively easy. That, for example, our agent with skill induction can like solve an average task with like 5 to 10 steps. But if you think about the tasks that humans do on their computers, were like occupational tasks, that some tasks may take like humans an hour or like several days to finish. And we had the study last year. We're recording the human computer use activities when they're doing different occupational tasks. And some of the trajectories have like thousands of actions. So I feel like it would be still kind of hard for agents to, successfully conduct those thousands of actions to do the tasks as humans, and also like being able to memorize them, but not exactly. You have to like collectively or smartly reuse them when you see a new task. Yeah.
Actually, this is a very good segue for me to ask what drives you to look at more human work, because in my opinion, since I have been following your work for a while, I think your previous work is more in a traditional computer science regime where you kind of train model, develop methodology to improve code generation or this agent in those agentic tasks. But I think starting from last year, you do focus more on the human side. Yeah. I do curious, what kind of triggered this change?
Yeah, I think I was more of an autonomous agent building person before last summer maybe. And I think one motivation is where a lot of work at that time to keep improving agents and need some source of like training examples. So there's a limitation of like how much annotated examples there are out there, and people are mostly just like synthesizing examples. If you just have a pure language model, synthesizing them, the quality is not ideal, And some people have like, oh, let the agent explore the environment, but there are not like super comprehensive or systematic. So I feel like there's an upper bound in like synthesizing agent examples by purely just leveraging language model, because in theory they may be just bounded by what language model know what to do, and they cannot like get more richer source than that. But I feel like humans are actually a very rich and natural source to, we do different kinds of computer use activities, and that's a great source to like at least benchmarking or like having the agents learn from.
So the goal is more to study the human to provide the training data to improve the agent.
But part of it is,
Okay.
But also like, I guess one big, not entirely realization, but we're building agents for humans to use. So like, we're kind of optimizing, we're beyond, when agents are performing beyond just like basic capabilities, now we're thinking about their real world utility. So how do you build these agents that are really useful for humans? So it's also useful to understand human workflows in a way to see, where could agent come in like be most helpful to humans.
Also, speaking of this, I found it very sometimes intriguing to think about the relationship between having a fully autonomous agent versus having human to work with the agent. Because I still remember when we two just met last year, and when we just have the research talk, we have actually a debate around automation versus collaboration. And I still remember you pushed back to me saying, well, does that mean if you guys work on more human agent collaboration stuff, like you guys are against the building automation agents? At that time, I remember my answer is, it's definitely important for us to push the limits of automation, because that means you will have certain part of your workflow capable of delegating to the agent. However, this does not kind of contradict with the idea we want to put the human agent work together.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that also like refreshes my conception of like autonomous agent and collaborative agents, because I think when I started working on agents, I thought they were like contradicting ideas, like we're just like building totally different things. But later I realized it mostly just depends on the scope of the task. So if you're, for example, if you're thinking of a simple task like write a report or analyze a table or something like that, then the agent, if the agent has the full capacity to automate that task, then it's like autonomous agent. But if you like broaden the view or scope of the task, like, oh, I'm actually preparing a pitch to like a company or a customer, and then one step of that is analyzing the data, and then we have a lot of other tasks like communicating with the team and stuff like that, then there definitely needs to be human involved on like either monitoring or like scheduling, coordinating different parts of the job, and then that will be human agent collaboration. So I feel like it's also interesting to see they're actually compatible with each other.
Yeah, I like this summary quite a lot, because I feel the reason why some people are also holding similar skepticism as you described is they normally view human agent collaboration just as very basic human in the loop. So they would assume it means, oh, at certain parts, the agent needs to ask human for help, or like this certain part that, oh, it's because the agent is not capable, so we need to delegate to human. So this is their old impression about human agent collaboration. But by saying having human agent work together, we are indeed trying to let them work together in a workflow level, right? It's like they can work together to achieve a larger goal, instead of we fix the cake as it is and then try to see, oh, we need to have human in the loop just because agent cannot do it.
Yeah, exactly. And as I like look more into like human agent, at least co-working together, I feel like there are also like interesting dimensions where like me working together with the agent on something actually performs similarly good or like even better solutions than I would do on myself. And it's like agents are sometimes exploring alternate paths of solving a task and something that I couldn't think of before. So I think it's also an interesting combination to see, for example, if we have a perfect depiction of the human agent profile and then like aggregating both together, maybe we can achieve bigger things.
But would you feel it would be scary? Suppose, like, it also have an assumption that a human need also keep adapt themselves. Like, even though at the very beginning you mentioned you try to summarize your PhD work as building adaptive agent, but based on the vision you just explained, it seems like the human side also needs to stay adaptive, right? Like they need to be willing to take even longer horizon tasks, trying to solve more complicated problems. Suppose some part can be delegated to the agent. So would you feel this would scare many, many people since it also pose some assumption on the human side?
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of inevitable for human to adapt because, like, for example, if I really want to learn or to use the agent, I actually need to like adapt to their behaviors or like specify things in ways that they can understand, and like instead of moving this to the left, saying moving this to like coordinates 20 or something like that. But I feel like it may not be necessarily just human having to do more complex tasks. Okay. Although I feel like it might be possible that they need to do like more tasks since like with AI's augmentation, like people's productivity increases.
Do you feel your productivity increased recently with agents?
Not necessarily, because I feel like it's kind of like you're spending more time on other tasks. Like if you're still doing the same tasks, instead of actually implementing things, now you're having to like take additional time to check it. For example, when like I'm the one writing the code or like writing the abstract, I don't have to do like additional verification step because as I'm doing it, I know all of the context. I'm like implicitly verifying throughout the process. But now if I'm allocating that implementation process to agent, I know I have zero context about it. So I have to take additional step, additional time of verification. So there's that transfer. But I think another thing is previously for like if I think about all the tasks that I do like in a work day, there are some tasks that I now delegate to agents, but now I just generally spending more time on doing other things that I couldn't before.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense, but I'm just curious, suppose we are looking at higher and higher level abstraction. This is definitely good, like people are even saying computer science is all about abstraction, right? But suppose this is really happening, we are moving one layer ahead of like one layer. Would you think in the future it will cause some problem on the human's capability? Like because we only care about higher level of the workflow, then maybe the human will get worse and worse. Suppose they suddenly need to do low level tasks. Like I'm just curious, for the vision you're describing, would it potentially lead to some degradation of human capability?
Yeah, like skill.
Yeah, like human skill, this is what I say.
Exactly. I was worried about that earlier this year, but I feel like now, so there are two sides of it. Initially, I felt kind of like upset if human don't get chance to like do some of the particular low-level actions and they don't actually know how to do this thing or like implement a certain thing. But later when I think about it, maybe it's fine if the agent can do a perfect job. It's fine to delegate it to agents, and that doesn't necessarily say that humans cannot do it. Like the fact that agents can do it, meaning that if humans want, humans can delegate that to agent. But if humans are just like enjoying the process of doing it, or just like want to learn how to do it, I think humans still has like all the reasons to do it. Another thing is, I feel like if you think about, there are tasks that like relatively high value and low value. Like value meaning parts of the things that I want to do are like high value, where like I get satisfaction from doing it. But I can like delegate the low value part to agents, and I can focus more on just like doing the high value parts. So I think there are more problems in size, even though agents can delegate more stuff.
Got you. So speaking of the value, would this affect like how you plan to choose your next task to do research upon? Because people are also, I think in the last few years, I heard a lot of sounds saying like the best time of doing research has already passed just because these agents are doing better job. They can even be used in AI research. But there are also people saying, well, the great time is yet to come. I'm just curious, would this kind of thinking affect how you choose the task or like a problem you work on for research?
I guess yes, it's definitely affecting, and that's I think at least for like software engineering domain, you can say the agent's like performing relatively well. I don't actually write a lot of code myself unless the agent are not able to figure out some of the specific like data formats. I think that actually affects me, and that was looking for like more like alternative reward tasks and then just like software engineering. So I actually did an analysis earlier this year that if you look at the human employment or like where the economic value concentrates, the software engineer only captures around like less than 5% of human employment. But there are a lot of like other occupations that out there that use computers. So there are a lot of very interesting tasks we haven't really explored. And I think compared to software engineering where we have like a large scale documentation on GitHub and like relevant sources, those other domains don't have such, or at least scaled up documentation yet. So I think it would still take a long time and some effort to properly document a lot of knowledge or even like tacit, implicit human expertise in those domains, and then like figuring out what tasks we need to build agents for and like how do we build agents for.
So do you think like the reason why for other domains besides software engineering, the agent performance is not that good yet? Is it just because lack of documentation, or is some other reason?
I think one is lack of documentation. Another is like as not as easily to be verified or instructed as coding and math problems. Like for coding, I think that's one of the reasons why I like it, is totally executable, verifiable, like interpretable, you know exactly what the model is doing. But on the other hand, it's like only applicable to a certain number of tasks. Like for very common tasks, even like writing a report, how do you have like a deterministic way of judging that? And I feel like if you ask like human annotators to write a rubric for it, there's no perfect like singular answer for it. And if you try to, or in our previous work, we tried to write like program verifiers to check the correctness, but it has this limitation, only checks, if the file exists or if it doesn't mention particular words, or we have to leverage like language model to say, if the quality is generally good. But people don't have like an explicit documented version of what is a perfect report. And it also varies a lot across different contexts, like finance reports, even for different companies that have different like format restrictions and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess there's a lot of varieties of correctness and high quality in this alternative task. But I think that's also a very interesting problem to have.
I see. So basically for other like less capable domains, besides just lack of documentation, another problem is this hard to verify problem, right? Yeah. Like some tasks, like some part of the human work is just inherently fuzzy. It's not like easy to have a program to give a check. But another thing I do find it interesting, like based on what you have described so far, is you're really into like the coding concept, right? Even saying now you are looking beyond software engineering, a lot of tasks, they still like agent can use tool like skill or writing code to do it. And again, even for verification, like what you just shared in your previous practice, like we can still construct certain program to help do it. So what do you think like the coding's role in agent development, even moving forward? I know like today's agent can already do coding pretty well, but do you think there's still room for improvement, or what's the direction if we still want to work on like AI for code, things like that?
For code, do you mean like coding as a task or coding as an approach?
This is a very interesting question. What do you mean by this?
Yeah, so like for coding as a task, essentially you're solving like software engineering problems like doing Sweetbench or other like coding benchmarks. But personally, I think like programming or coding in general is a very general approach to solve different tasks. So like you can write programs to analyze data or like design logos as agents do. So yeah, that's the...
Yeah, then I think I'm referring to the latter.
What's the question?
No, the question is like, given the AI is already very good in generating code or even just producing the code, even in the agent concept, do you think there is still need to improving their capability to just produce code? Definitely this code could be used as approach.
Yeah, I think so far, I feel like for using coding as approach to solve a lot of different real-world tasks, it still requires a lot of development because like most of the tasks previously are only like humans doing it, and like most humans don't, for example, design logos, we just drag things on the canvas. I never personally like write programs to do it. So there's like, it's unclear where it's like at least not documented or like no one has annotated that data before. Like how do you write, what's the perfect program to reproduce that logo? And there are other stuff like, there are some more program-friendly formats like Markdown or HTML versus a lot of the where common data formats are like docs, and there needs like special transformation. So a lot of to actually explore what's the perfect like programming solution to a lot of tasks, I feel like requires a lot of effort to do it. I feel like there might be some like forces against it because, you know, some people are actually kind of against AI, AGI, and they're like, don't really want to use AI in general.
Some people, you mean like people in certain occupation, or just like, oh, it's not really an occupation problem?
Well, I haven't really done that survey yet, but I feel like, or at least some friends that I know like outside CS, for example, if they're designers and they would be like, AI is like, doesn't really have creativity, but it's like generating figures automatically, and I don't really like it. But there's this force of, I think there's also the voice that, you know, the big companies saying that, oh, AI will replace humans' jobs. And I feel like even though it might mostly for now just means for software engineering jobs and not like entirely a lot of other human occupations, but it sort of like threatens the human workers on, oh, this is like an evil entity that are gonna replace my job, then what am I gonna do? And these people don't really actually have like I guess calibrated understanding of the agent capability. I mean, they can actually benefit from it, but because of this external voices, that makes them actually don't really want to try it in the beginning.
Got you. Do you think, is there anything like as agent developer we can do anything to change this?
I feel like one thing is like, or at least for us, like changing the way how we frame AI. One is like now not as a like in an evil way, like, oh, we're gonna replace your job and like you have nothing to do, but like, oh, it's actually a good like friendly tool they can use to like boost your productivity or help you like brainstorm different ideas when you don't have any. There are like positive ways to utilize those. But another thing is we can build agents to solve particular tasks that won't like threaten humans if you want to do it. I mean, as I said, like for example, for human work there are like high value tasks and low value tasks. For example, doctors, they find like diagnosing the patients are like high value parts, and that's where they're like trained for. But there are other low value parts like, oh, you have to like document like the every like details of the patient, and that takes them a lot of time. But if you like actually target like building AI agents for those low value tasks, actually doctors would be very happy to see that there are actually examples of startups doing that. And like at one time I went to hospital and the doctor very happily like introducing this tool to me.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's very cool.
Yeah, so I feel like if you build it in the right way, people will be happy with it. But yeah, I think in general, just like as very contextualized for different occupations, and like different people may have different preferences too.
Yeah, I totally resonate because sometimes I feel we are all sort of in this AI bubble. Like we really know what this AI can do, but we also don't really know what other people want this AI to do, right? So this misalignment of what we are building versus those people we try to build for. And one suggestion or like one kind of solution you are providing here is suppose we can really understand different type of human work. And if we are able to identify those high value and low value one, this would help us set the priority for the AI agent development. But again, I think going back to your old argument saying some people, they just don't trust the agent. It seems like besides even just their perception, it might also be how the agents now are performing, right? Like right now, I think major companies are pushing these agents to execute longer and longer, right? Like there has been a lot of study trying to check how long this agent can execute on its own. Suppose this is keep happening, I feel it will be very hard for human even to build trust with this agent.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that's where several problems with it. Like for example, if you just keep track of the agent running time, that doesn't necessarily mean agents have like greater autonomy. Sometimes they could just be stuck in the same loop and just like doing a lot of things again and again and just burning tokens with themselves. So like if you track the scale of the tasks that they're able to complete, they're actually not improving by just like running for 5 hours. And I feel like that might be, sometimes there are issues with the training. They're just like optimizing false signals sometimes. But I feel like even though agents can just doing meaningful things for like 5 hours straight, I agree there are issues like verification or like how easily can humans steer agents. And there are, I think there's a lot of interesting problems to study and maybe like rooms for improvement. I personally don't really like most agents have this like chat log centered interface, and like I couldn't read it. I don't know like if anyone can actually.
What do you think the right interface should roughly look like?
Well, I personally, if going back to our like previous finding on like humans respond better to like interface and like visual signals, then at least for like artifact-driven tasks. For example, if I'm just like designing a logo, I don't want to look at the concrete like Python script the agent write or like messages on cool. I just like programmed this and that. What if you just show me the design and that would like respond much better to it? And I think it would be interesting to have like an interface that can accommodate to both like humans like interface prone activities and like agents computer prone activities. So like agents can write programs like in whichever programming language they want to, and you can just render that program like render it as a slide or like a logo, and humans can look at the rendered visual side, and a human can take activities on that too. So I think that would be easier for both agents and humans.
Yeah, also I remember you just mentioned like also visualizing more context, because for human, when you try to analyze a lot of human workflows, humans are good at like processing visual content. But even besides this, it also reminds me when I first look at the induced workflow, one reaction I had is it really makes me easy to understand what is happening. Because as you mentioned, like even with a short period of time, this AI can sometimes take a really long sequence of actions. And it's almost impossible for me as a human to supervise it. However, if you show me a structured workflow, which means it has hierarchy, then it just makes me more able to supervise, to see what these things is actually happening. So probably, potentially one way to solve the problem, besides the visualization, is actually also use the workflow maybe as a way to help scaffolding how human can understand what the agent is doing.
Yeah. It's like if it's not necessary, where like humans do not need to know every tiny detail of the agent activities, and then you can just like provide a higher level summary to the human and like just notify all the like necessary things, but that's more efficient in communication.
This is actually a nice segue for me to ask more about future-looking questions.
Okay.
I'm curious right now, given you have been spending a lot of time analyzing how the agent work and also how the human work, but also you spend a lot of time building autonomous agents to make sure it can handle certain dedicated parts. What is the future that excites you the most?
Yeah, I feel like first there are still a lot of interesting questions on how to build better agents for like the broader range of tasks. And I'm also very interested in, because like I think we're kind of implicit in mentioning this, that like different contexts, like companies or individuals that have different preferences and like different solutions to even the same task. So there needs to be like adaptation, but if you want to build it for like a long time, like 5-year, 10-year, then how would that like agent architecture look like? And like back to our initial discussion on like context and weight-based adaptation, is there like one way that's better than another, where like do we have to develop like a organic combination of both? Another direction I think is interesting is like as the agents are actually performing much better, I feel like it's very helpful to utilize them to like empower humans in some way, like at least for certain tasks that at least there's a certain group of people where like agents' knowledge or ability to solve tasks are better than those people. So it can be used as in some way like an educational tool, or like a very strong augmentation to help people do something they cannot do before.
But suppose the agent can already teach human, why won't we just let the agent do it? Why we still need the human to do the job?
I guess like it's for like educational purposes, where like in general humans just enjoy getting more knowledge, where like the process of being able to do something. Even though, for example, you can buy any like dishes from the restaurant, but you still like enjoy the process of actually learning, practicing how to do it yourself. I hope like it's still necessary for humans to like continue to learn this like occupational tasks or domain knowledge, because we still need some people to like supervise those agents to do better, or at least make sure they're performing a good job.
I see. So even when we think about personalization, I hope to see a future where it's actually not just agent adapting to what the human want, but it's also like a co-evolve, right? It's like this is something what we so enjoy human collaboration is, for example, suppose I collaborate with you for a relatively long time. Both of us actually improve in the process. It's not like just single direction.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, because for now I'm really interested in like how agents could actually just adapt based on their interaction with humans, and I think it's useful for humans to learn from agents too. But I do have like somewhat concerns on that. In like, for example, agents tend to solve tasks in a particular way. For example, cloud has a certain design style. Then like if every human learn from the same agent, and just like, for example, do you want to see your kids like, or like the entire class producing the same cloud style poster? So that would be kind of less ideal. But I think if like that's also like motivating, I think, better design of like agents are able to produce like diverse outputs, like featuring different versions of intelligence, I guess.
Got you. I'm just thinking, like, suppose you're envision like, oh, more excitement would come when we are trying to adapt this agent for a longer horizon, longer horizon of interacting with a specific human, or just to see like how this larger memory would be incorporated. Do you think, suppose you want to work on this topic in academia, would you have enough resource? Given it's about, oh, we want to execute longer, or like we put more resource. Is this something academia can still make meaningful contribution?
I hope so. I feel like some universities, at least they have like a certain amount of compute, not at the scale of like frontier labs in the industry, but at least it supports like doing smaller models. But I guess another thing is like we can also collaborate with industry. Like academia and industry are not like against each other. I mean, they want to get, the crazy minds from academia, but we also want like support for additional resources. I think there could be ways of doing that. I hope so.
Yeah, this is a tough question. But anyway, I'm curious, what would you envision, like, what would things be like just maybe 2 years later? I won't say like maybe 10 years, it's just hard to predict, but how would you think like 2 years later, what type of question you would be working on?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think as I mentioned, like figuring out, continual adaptation of agents, how that architecture will look like. And also, I feel like, for example, a lot of people are not focusing on personalization as if it's the last mile of agent development. But I feel like there are more to it, because I feel like the agent performance now is like totally not ideal. For example, if I asked it to make slides, I wouldn't just like use it directly for my PhD defense or something. So I feel like there's still room to go. But back from like, personalization, how do you build, suppose you have like 1,000 personalized agent, but now you want to deliver the next like better version of models, then you have to like, how do you identify the parts that are just like general greater knowledge from all these individual experiences, and like disentangle that from like just personalized preferences, and like continue to build like greater models for the general public. I think that's an interesting idea too. Another thing is like having agents to empower humans, because I feel like I really care about humans, and I just want like us to have better life with AI in general. To some extent, I feel like if maybe using it in the correct way, I feel like AI could also be like actually a way to like democratize education. For example, people don't have access to like educational resources or like a lot of knowledge in certain domain, but now they can just like pay $20 to like access to advanced ways in solving some tasks. I guess used in correct ways, there could be some promising sides to it.
Yeah, that's very, very exciting. And finally, just to end our discussion today, can you share like one takeaway you have, basically like how you think about moving from pure technical science to do more like human-centered research?
I think in general, we're just building agents for humans. So we have to consider, how humans do it, what tasks do people want agents to do when we're developing the systems. Yeah, and I feel like actually in the beginning, I personally don't like the idea of like agents automating everything and just like agents doing everything. So now I think after incorporating the human side into my research, I actually feel more empowered.
So it's all come very naturally.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's an amazing discussion, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.